It's really great to be here, so thanks to the organizers for inviting me. As you have seen on the slide here, I'm going to be talking about permissionless consensus. So this notion of permissionless consensus is not a well-defined concept. So when I say permissionless, in essence, what I mean is anyone can join consensus. It's a consensus where free joining, free entry, okay? I have a lot of slides to cover today in the next two talks. I probably won't be able to go through all of it. It's basically a whole class on consensus. So a lot of things are going to be pretty fast, but at least the goal will be to try to convey the high-level ideas and high-level, the key concepts that are involved in what's today called permissionless consensus. I just want to warn you, I might not get all the historical references right. I'm trying to cover a lot of material here, so if I'm missing some papers, it's not intentional. I really try to convey the concepts and sometimes not giving all the right references. Okay, before we move on to the permissionless setting, let's just review quickly what consensus is. You have already heard a great talk by Valeria on this on the first day, so it should probably be familiar, but let me recall it anyway quickly. So we have a set of nodes here, and these nodes would like to, in essence, agree on an ordered set of transactions. We sometimes call this ordered set of transactions a ledger, but really think of it just as a list of data that is ordered. So transaction 1, transaction 2, transaction 3, I don't care what's inside. So all throughout this talk today, I won't care about the content of the transactions. It's just a list of messages, in essence. And why do we want these nodes to agree on it? Well, the key point here is that we would like to not have a single computer store this list of transactions, but rather we would like to replicate this data among lots of different nodes, so that if some of them go down or are malicious, we can still recover the content. So it's a way to replicate this data and ensuring that the data actually remains there. And in order to kind of define what it means for this data to remain there, we require two properties for a protocol, for such a replication protocol. The first one is consistency, and the second one is liveness. Consistency roughly means that any two nodes here that are honest, they will actually agree on the set of transactions. And the second one is liveness, which means that if someone wants to add new transactions, eventually that will actually happen. Okay? I'm going to define these properties a little bit more carefully shortly. I just want to point out here that this name consensus, there are lots of different names for the same task in the literature. So state machine replication, a public ledger, or something that we today call a permission blockchain is in essence exactly the same thing, it's just consensus. It is exactly this task. Okay? So what makes this permissioned? We have a fixed set of nodes doing this. Okay? And this is a concept that's been studied for a long time, several decades, 4 decades at least. Okay. So let's go over consistency and liveness a little bit more formally, because they're a little bit tricky to define. So consistency roughly was meant to say, take any two honest nodes, their view of what the ledger is should agree. Right? Now, that's never going to actually happen if we're receiving messages and these not get delivered at exactly the same time. Could be that my ledger has just been updated to include the new transaction and you haven't seen it yet. That's fine. That's not a problem. So what we'll require is actually that take any two nodes, they're honest. My view of this ledger is either a prefix of yours or yours is a prefix of mine. So the way to think about this is to say, look, we agree except maybe for some very recent new transactions that just came in. Now, this is how people typically define it, the first property. Turns out that that actually is not enough. So it's a little bit subtle, and many definitions in literature actually miss this. So it's not just enough to say that any two nodes agree. it's important also that I agree with myself in the future. Because otherwise, we could have a protocol that says, today, we all think that the list of transaction contains A. And tomorrow, we think it's B. We all agree, but they're different. So we would also like to get what's called future self-consistency. I would like to agree with myself in the future. So if I see something now, that should not be removed. Are you with me? Okay, and then the second one is liveness. And liveness, we said, was roughly speaking the idea that if someone likes to add a new transaction, then it will get added to the ledger. It might take some time, but it's going to happen. Now, the notion of liveness I will consider is a pretty strong notion, and that's actually what we want in all these blockchain applications. We should actually have an upper bound on the time it takes for a transaction to get there. To just say, look, eventually to get added is not enough. We want to make sure that I would like to buy my coffee now, the transaction should get in there within 10 seconds, okay? So the way we'll formalize it, there exists some function. For us, it's going to be a polynomial, confirm. And we have the property, if some honest player would like to add a transaction, in that case, it should get added to everybody's ledger within confirm of delta time, where delta is a bound on the network latency. So network latency is the time it takes for a message to get delivered to everybody in the network. I can never hope to do better than if it takes me 10 seconds for a message to get delivered to everybody, I can never hope that it gets added before that. So that's kind of delta is a lower bound of what it takes. But now we require also it should never take more than some confirm of delta. Okay? And ideally, we want this confirm to be as small as possible. Now, there are also two different models in the literature that will be considered actually more models, but I will focus only on two different models. One is what's called the synchronous model. And the easiest way to think about this is that we have this upper bound delta of the network delivery, and the protocol can be aware of it. Okay? And typically, the way protocols in the synchronous model work is that basically they proceed in rounds where every round takes delta time, and we're waiting for the message to get there. So I send a message, I'm going to wait delta, and then I act, and then I know that whenever someone sends a message, it gets to me. Okay, so they work step by step. That's why I call synchronous, and everything takes time delta. And then we have the same partially synchronous model. And the easiest way to think about this model is to say, look, the protocol is unaware of what big delta is. Okay, there is some big delta, but the protocol is not aware of it. And therefore, typically these protocols have this property called being responsive. If delta actually turns out to be much smaller, then they run much faster, because the protocol is not a function of delta. There are actually many different ways of defining partial synchrony. For simplicity, I'm going to use this way of defining it. That's the easiest and to think about. Yeah?
In practice, how do you set delta, max network?
How do you set delta? So we'll discuss that when we will discuss it in terms of, you should be answering that question. How does Algorand set delta? So the way you set it is you just pick some reasonable upper bound on what, you're talking about the synchronous model?
I mean, by the very definition of max network.
Okay, so you take some, so let's say in Bitcoin, people typically assume that messages get delivered to everybody else within 10 seconds. That's maybe a very pessimistic upper bound, and if you use some other type of system, maybe you can assume something much smaller, like 2 seconds. 2 seconds maybe is a good upper bound on what it takes to get a message delivered to 99% of the network. Okay, but indeed, this is a reason why people in general are less happy about the synchronous model, because there the protocol needs to be parameterized by it. Okay, so partially synchronous protocols are nicer because we don't need to parameterize it. Now, it's true, like in practice, actually, people work, there's a variant of this partial synchronous model called the GST model, where you have an upper bound, but you also want the protocol to run in time that is dependent on the real network latency. So there are various different variants, and that's what people typically use in practice. Let me not go into those nuances and just focus on this scenario. Is model clear?
You talk about wanting to minimize delta as much as possible.
No, I'm not minimizing delta. Delta is something that's given to me externally.
But so in your
I'm minimizing conform.
right, sorry. So in your buying coffee example, you're saying I need the transaction to be confirmed in order for the coffee to be bought.
Yeah.
Can there be a model where you have like multiple concepts of liveness? One of them where you get immediate responsiveness and you get some like economic liveness, and then later on you have...
Yes, we can. I'm not going to go into all these like subtleties now. I would like to keep it very simple to just say like, look, I want pure, consistency and liveness, and indeed there are, towards the end maybe we'll discuss that a little bit, there are some optimistic notions of liveness where I'm like, I'm pretty sure and that's good enough, but let's keep it simple. Okay, so the key point is that we have this nice notion of replication, and these two security properties. And if you have them, it's quite easy to see that this protocol will in essence emulate having a trusted third party that is maintaining this ordered list of transactions. Right, so think of having a trusted third party, you can give transactions to it, they will get added within confirm of delta to its list, and then people can come and ask the trusted third party, what is the list? And it will provide the answer. Okay? And then this consistency property basically says that the answer it gives to two people is going to be roughly the same up until what happened in the last maybe delta steps. Okay, that's why we want it, and that's why consensus is great. For instance, for a cryptocurrency, because we can now keep track of all the transactions in a stable way. Now. What I didn't mention here on the first slide, these two properties will not hold unconditionally, right? But rather, we're going to require these two properties to hold under some conditions on the players. Typically, something like 2/3 of the nodes here are honest, or maybe half of them are honest. So as long as that holds, these two properties will hold. Okay, and that's much better than just say, here's a single guy, if that guy is honest, then it holds. Now it's much more distributed, decentralized. As long as a fraction of the players are honest, we have actually really implemented this trusted ledger. Okay, so that is the classic model, and that has been studied since at least the 80s, 1980s. And let me now point out some really crucial features of this classical study of consensus, or what they call permission blockchains. The first one is, we typically have a small set of players. Okay, we have 10 nodes. Let's say even 10 is pretty big for these protocols. And the number is fixed. These are 10 guys sitting, 10 servers sitting in the basement at Google, and we know the numbers, and we know the identity of these nodes. These are nodes that are specified typically by a single entity. So the identities are known. Okay. These nodes are not coming and going, they're there. They stick around for the whole execution. Okay. And finally, since these nodes are known to each other, we can often assume that they have a way of, it's very important to have a way of authenticating each other. They know who the rest of the nodes are. And typically, we can assume that there is a public key infrastructure also. Okay? So the number of nodes is fixed, they stick around, and there is authentication. And really, the permission here is this. There is something that authenticates you, and that allows you to join. If you don't have that credential to join, you cannot join. That's why it's permissioned. Now, I here said authenticate chance / PKI as if they're basically the same thing. In practice, they are basically the same thing. But in theory, it turns out that there's a quite big distinction whether you have authenticated channels or whether you have a public key infrastructure. And really, the classical setting can be characterized in a super, super simple way. These two lines fully characterize consensus in the classical setting. Okay? So throughout this talk, I'll try to actually give you kind of a hint of how some of these like lower bounds in distributed systems are proved, because they're super elegant and simple and cute, and so I try to convey the intention behind them. Okay, but let me first state the results, and I'll take a question. So in the synchronous setting, remember we had these two settings. Synchronous means the protocol knows what delta is and depends on it typically. So it works in these lock steps of time delta. And then in partially synchronous setting, the protocol is not aware of what delta is. Okay. In a synchronous setting, if you have authenticated channels, you can get a protocol with under 2/3 honesty. So if 2/3 of the nodes are honest, you can get a protocol, and that's also necessary. You cannot do better than 2/3. Okay? If you have more than 1/3 bad players, then you cannot do it. However, if you have a PKI, you can beat the 2/3 bound, and you can get a protocol as long as there's one honest guy. Okay? That requires now also using digital signatures, which is you can get from one-way functions. So there is a difference between PKI and authenticated channels. On the other hand, if you move on to the partially synchronous setting, well, then you can still do it, assuming 2/3. That's a better result, right? Because now you don't assume synchrony. The only if is a weaker result than this, because this is harder to achieve. But intriguingly, the only if works even if you have a PKI. So now that's an orthogonal result, right? So even if you have a PKI, it doesn't help you to get beyond 2/3 if you're in a partial synchronous setting. So we see here that there is actually an inherent efficiency gap between authenticated channels and PKI.
Can you hint why is there like a gap?
Yes. In fact, thank you for the question. I asked Elon to ask it before. Let me actually give you the first impossibility result, which is going to show you why we need 2/3 with partial synchrony, why we need 2/3 honesty. In fact, I'm going to show you both of these impossibility results, but we'll start with this and then we move on to that later on, okay? When Gilad asks a question. No. Okay, so let me now argue to you in a somewhat hand-wavy way, but this is really the whole proof, why you cannot get a consensus protocol that handles more than 1/3 malicious entities under partial synchrony. Okay? So what you will do is you're going to consider execution with 3 players. Okay. We have here, the top player here is an attacker. He's the bad guy. And then we had player 1 and player 2. So 1/3 are now malicious, right? What the attacker is going to do is going to run the protocol honestly with this guy. Okay? And he's going to try to add a transaction called TX1. And let this be a random n-bit transaction. Okay, it's important that it's a long transaction, n bits long, random string. Okay? With this guy, player 2 or Q2, he's going to do the same. He runs the protocol honestly, but now sending transaction TX2. Okay, again, a random string. Okay? Here, we're going to assume the communication is very fast, and here also very fast. But here, we're going to assume it's super long. Okay? So the real delta is actually very long. Let's assume delta is like 10 minutes. Okay? Unreasonable, but you know, the protocol needs to work for any delta. And the protocol is unaware of what delta is. Right? So now let's look at what happened between these two guys here. This guy is actually running the protocol honestly, right? So we can really think of this as being an honest execution here with a delta that's very small. This is 1 second, okay? And this guy being a malicious guy that's just not even sending anything. So by consistency and liveness with respect to these two guys, we have that this guy needs to output TX1 within time confirm of 1 second, right? Because delta could have been 1 second. That is an upper bound on all the communication. So therefore, we have by liveness, that thing needs to be output.
There is a very slow connection.
No, yeah. So look, think of this as honest guy, this is honest guy, and this is a bad guy. The slow connection is like this guy is a silent bad guy. So now we have two honest guys talking, right? And we're trying to provide transaction TX1. Okay, so within TX1, within confirm of 1 second. Okay, so for simplicity, think confirm as being 10 times delta, okay? Typically we have these type of bounds, okay? In fact, you can get even things will have 3 delta for typical protocols, okay? So we know here that within 3 seconds, this needs to provide an output and TX1 needs to be there, okay? I would argue now that TX2 should not be there, okay? Why is that? Because within 1 second, none of the messages have gotten through here. So this guy has not seen anything about TX2. And remember, TX2 is a random string. So the probability that TX2 is going to be there is 2 to the minus n. Okay?
So when on this arrow that says very slow connection, do we imply that there is another?
What I mean by very slow here is anything that's longer than conform of 1 second. So to formalize this thing, you put this.
But this is not just a connection. This is somebody being in the middle. And
No. There's no one in the middle. There's one guy here and 2 honest guys.
so what does delta mean? Delta is an upper bound.
Delta is an upper bound on the network, on the time it takes for a message to get delivered. But remember, in partial synchronous model, the protocol needs to provide this output within time confirm of delta, right? But it's unaware of what delta is. So if I look at these 2 guys, the upper bound on communication between honest guys is actually very small. So delta, you can think of delta as being very small. Okay, so this is like an honest execution with a small delta and having this guy being dishonest. Okay?
Isn't there a difference between partial synchronous
Let's not get into this eventual asynchronous things. I want to just focus on these 2, partial synchrony and synchrony.
So you're saying that they should output something.
So this guy is going to output TX1, but it's very unlikely within confirm 1 that it's going to output TX2 because there's no information about it. And the same thing here. And now we have broken consistency because now we have 2 good guys that are actually outputting. Well, this guy might actually output TX2 at some point later on. It probably will, who knows? But at least TX1 is going to come before TX2 here, and here TX2 is going to come before TX1. And that's a contradiction. So now you've seen why you cannot do better than 2/3. And this works no matter if there's a PK, public key or not. This guy is not, doesn't need to emulate others.
So authenticated channel won't help you here.
Sorry?
You said that authenticated channels will help you? With
No. This is a strong result. This works even if you have public key infrastructure, right? That's the point. But I'm using here partial synchrony. With authenticated channel, you can prove it also in synchrony. And we'll see that later on. That's going to be a little bit more complicated, okay?
Can you explain how adding another honest party helps to solve the problem?
Let me try to move on now because I have a lot of content to do, but it's let me do it offline, okay? It's actually a fun thing to think about. I'll let you think about it, okay? All right, so now I would like to move on to the permissionless setting. Okay, so what's the permissionless setting? The permissionless setting was introduced through Bitcoin and Nakamoto's paper in 2009. And this really differs from the permission setting in all the 3 different, in the 3 points we had before. They're all going to be different. So the first one is, we don't know how many nodes that are there, okay? And number 2, they don't stick around. Nodes come and go. So you're joining for 1 hour, then you're leaving. Then when you wake up, you join again, and so on. So nodes are coming and going. We don't know how many are there. And finally, we have this important anyone can join property, which typically is thought of saying there's no authentication mechanisms. We have no way of checking if somebody can join, and that's why anybody can join. Right, and that's why it's called permissionless. No authentication needed to join. Now, there is one final thing that I would like to add to that, which is a new property that started becoming very important when discussing these type of permissionless protocols, is that since we don't know who's joining and anybody can join, we also need to think about economical issues here and incentives. So typically we want something also called economic robustness, which ensures that people are properly incentivized to run the protocol. Okay? So that's a very important property. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk much about it today. Okay, I'm going to focus on the top 3 ones. There's one more thing that I'd like to mention here in this setting, and that's going to be kind of like an axiom, that when we talk about permissionless protocols, we really consider protocols that are run in a huge setting, in a massive, large-scale setting. And it's just not feasible then to have everybody to participate in the protocol. So what we typically want is a protocol where the computation of the protocol is polylogarithmic in the number of entities involved. Okay. So, as I mentioned, I'm not going to focus much on economic robustness. I have some slides towards the end about it, but I probably won't get to them. And even if we don't talk about economic robustness here, even just from a standard computer science perspective, because now if we just consider these things, we're really considering consensus, distributed systems, but with some under relaxed assumptions. And it's still a very, very interesting problem, and we are really have learned a lot in the last almost not on 10 years, but getting there. But we're still really at the beginning of understanding it, and it's a lot of things that are still unknown, and a lot of exciting things that are happening in the last few years. So really, let's start with this thing, because in some sense that seems to be like the most pertinent issue, right? As you said, permissionless means anyone can join. So let's focus on what happens when there is no authentication mechanism around. Okay? And in fact, during my PhD, together with Barak, Canetti, Lindell, and Rabin. We actually consider this problem. What can you do with cryptography if you don't have authentication? Okay, and already on page 1 in intro, we said, look, we have to give up on consensus, because without any authentication, it's really impossible to get any type of agreement. So it was a very simple impossibility. And then let's move on trying to see if we can achieve cryptography without agreement. Yeah. So that was really being on the wrong side of history, because only a few years later, Nakamoto actually managed to achieve consensus in this model, but we'll get to that later. Let me start by actually going over how you can prove such a thing. Okay? So the original paper showed that for partial synchronous, now we know how to prove such an impossibility also in the synchronous model. And let me go over this. So why you cannot get consensus in the standard synchronous model without authentication mechanism. And the proof is really something that should be familiar to you guys. If you don't have any authentication, I can just pretend I'm lots of good guys, and then it seems impossible to leverage honesty in any way, because an attacker can just pretend he's lots of good guys, and then he can vote many times, so we can never get any agreements. Okay? So let's see how to formalize this thing. We're going to consider a real protocol running with some random transaction TX1. We're still on these random transactions. Okay? And now consider this alternative universe. Okay? And in this alternative universe, we have some attacker pretending he's a bunch of honest guys running with some other random transaction T2. These two worlds have no interaction with one another. Right? There's a real one, and there's a pretended one. Okay? If I join late, okay, and I talk to the real people and the attacker, who will I trust? Well, by consistency, I should always trust the good guys. right? But they really look exactly the same. So it's impossible. So with a picture, and this is like, this alternative universe argument is one of the most classic type of lower bounds in distributed systems. It comes over and over again in lots of different guises. So it's a great argument to see. Yeah?
Sorry, what's again the argument about the alternative universe?
Okay, so let me go over it again slowly, okay? Okay. So we have some real execution that's running with some transaction tx1. Okay? That needs to output tx1 in its input, right? But it's not going to have tx2 there. Everybody agrees? Okay. Or with high probability, because there's no information about tx2. Now, here we have the attacker. There's no authentication mechanism, so he can just pretend he's all the good guys and just run the protocol there. Okay. This thing must include tx2. Okay. But not tx1. Now, a new guy joins. Okay. And he joins the net group of players. The bad guys are going to send him everything here. The good guys are going to send him that. And he participates in the protocol now. Now, what I claim is by consistency, what he outputs needs to be the same as this. Okay? On the other hand, I could have just flipped the names of real and ideal, and therefore, he should also output that. So he can't output both things.
It seems that there is an assumption that the protocols work by counting.
No count. No, there's no counting here. That is like the intuition for how protocol, like, but this proof doesn't, the proof doesn't, but the intuition, really, yes, I think Hugo's intuition is a very good intuition to say. We should really think of consensus as a way to, if we have some conflict on what should be the right thing, we need to do some voting, okay? We need to do voting to agree on what the right thing to do. And if the attacker can vote for others, then he can just, vote lots of times and always get the majority for what he wants. And break consistency.
So when the attacker runs this simulation, do they need to know like the other party's inputs or something?
No. The consensus doesn't have any inputs. Okay. It just runs it, yeah. All right, so at this point in time in history, 2005, it's generally believed we cannot get consensus unless we have authentication. And then a few years later, Nakamoto's paper came around, and he prevented these type of Sybil attacks, because what happened there was a Sybil attack is a good guy, the bad guy is pretending to be lots of good guys. And the way he's going to prevent against these Sybil attacks is to say, look, to emulate a good guy should be expensive. It requires computational effort. So sure, you can emulate good guys if you want to, but that will require you to do a lot of computation. And now, instead of requiring something like 2/3 of the guys are honest, we're going to make an assumption about the computational power of an attacker. And say, as long as the attacker's computational power is less than half of the total power out there in the world, in that case, the protocol is going to be secure.
It's voting weighted by...
So in some sense, really, once you think of Nakamoto's protocol, say, let's do this type of voting, but I'm going to, in order to vote, I need to waste some computational power. I need to burn 1 tree for every vote I'm submitting. Okay? Hey.
In the permission setting, the lower bound is 1/3, or like 2/3.
Oh, we'll get to that, okay? Yes, it's a great question. In fact, yes. So then the cool thing here is that Nakamoto had this protocol, and he claims that this protocol actually is secure, assuming honest majority. Okay? And as a question there was like, it's kind of bizarre, because we said it was also a lower bound of 2/3. Okay? So, thanks for the question. So that is really, there are two amazing things here. This protocol breaks 2 barriers. The first is this an authentication barrier, that it was impossible to get anything without authentication. And the second one actually breaks the 1/3 barrier. All right? Because we said that, we need, without a public key infrastructure, we need 1/3 honesty. So this is now a good time to see this impossibility result and why Nakamoto breaks it. This one is a little bit confusing, so I'm not going to try to spend too much time on it because this is really, one can get stuck for a long time on discussing this lower bound. It's very simple to see, but it's kind of mind-boggling the way it works. So go ahead. Yeah.
Well, that's not entirely true, I think, because Nakamoto assumes synchrony. So.
Nakamoto assumes, indeed, Nakamoto can synchrony, but there's no public infrastructure.
Yeah, but the one from barrier is called partial synchrony.
No. The one I showed you before was for partial synchrony. Now let me show you the one that works on in a synchronous setting. Okay? So I told you that in a synchronous setting, there's also 1/3 lower bound. Right? As long as you don't have a PKI. So here is how this lower bound works. And as I mentioned, now I only have one slide. I'll try to do this fast. And if you don't get it now, go back to it and try to think it over slowly, because it's kind of a mind-boggling lower bound. It's really beautiful. Okay, so again, let's consider a protocol with 3 players. Okay, and we're going to assume that one of them is malicious. Okay? And so we'd like to show that we cannot have a protocol that handles one malicious guy. So what we're going to do now is to consider this protocol. Here's the protocol running honestly with Silvio, Srini, and Silvia. Shafi, Srini, and Silvia. But let's actually run 2 of these protocols connected together like that. So whenever Shafi is sending a message that's supposed to go to Silvio, she's going to send it to a different version of Silvio here. And then he's going to talk to another Srini and another Shafi, and then whatever she sends, like this. So running the protocol honestly, but in this little loop. It's kind of mind-boggling. Okay? And we're going to run it so that this Srini here is going to try to propose a transaction tx0, and this Srini is going to try to propose a transaction tx1. Okay? And then we'll see what happens. So let's consider first Silvio here. What should he output? Now he's talking to Srini, and Srini is acting honestly here. He's acting honestly, and now he's talking to Shafi here, and message coming from Shafi here. So from their point of view, they're considering an honest execution where Srini is providing input 0, a transaction 0, and just Shafi is sending some confusing messages. So because they're both honest, we conclude that Silvio needs to output transaction 0. Okay? By the same argument, looking here at Srini, Shafi, and Silvio, Srini and Shafi here are honest, but now talking to a confusing Silvio that's sending messages that are inconsistent. So by the same argument, she needs to output 1. Okay? But that means now that we have, if we look at this execution of Silvio being honest, Shafi being honest, and Srini being malicious, right? That's one malicious guy. We've broken consistency because Silvio is outputting 0 and Shafi is outputting 1. Make sense? And therefore, consistency broken. Now this lower bound does not work if you have public infrastructure. No, sorry. It works even if authenticated channels. So yes, it does. Let me just point out one more thing. This lower bound that I just sketched you now here oversimplifies a little bit the consensus setting. The lower bound I gave you here is for something called agreement, where you're trying to agree on one bit, either 0 or 1. The way I defined consensus was with transactions. So it was really like a blockchain. So when I say here it outputs 0, could be that Silvio outputs 0, okay, transaction 0, and Shafi outputs transaction 1, but they might also output transaction 0, right? The way I define things here, I haven't really told you anything about the order. Before, I made sure it outputs transaction 0, not transaction 1, because I had no information about transaction 1 or transaction 2. But here, the information about 1 actually gets transmitted around, right? So it could very well be that this guy outputs 1 also. So it's not completely trivial to transform this into an impossibility of consensus, the way I define it for a blockchain, because you can output both transaction 0 and transaction 1. However, if you make this loop very long, you can make sure that actually you need to output something before that information is propagated through, and therefore you can get the same type of impossibility. Okay?
And that's where the synchrony assumption will be used, right?
So this impossibility works even if you have synchrony, right? It's a strong impossibility, okay, that works even in the synchronous model. But here, if you have a public infrastructure, you can get around this, right? Okay, and I want to just mention one more thing. Let's look at what Srini needs to do here. In his attack, Srini actually needs to emulate these guys. He needs to emulate the two honest guys here. So if you think of this protocol as being something that's computationally expensive, now then this attack actually is computationally expensive to do. Right? Does it make sense? Like this attack relies on what's called free simulation, that I can simulate people freely. If computation is expensive, then it's actually costly to simulate you. And therefore, if you look at the computational power of the attacker here, it's much more than 1/3. It's going to be, in fact, more than 1/2, because he needs to simulate these two guys also. So at the very least, he needs to do all the work of Sylvia and Shafi. So if they require a lot of work, then he needs to do at least that, plus himself. So the computational power required here is at least the same as the honest guys. Okay. And the next thing to point out here, the reason this doesn't work if you have public infrastructure is that Srini cannot simulate these two guys, because they cannot generate messages if I don't know your secret key. So that's why this only works in the authenticated model. Okay, so what we're going to do now is first, I'm going to provide to you an abstract model of what a blockchain is. Okay, and now we're going to ask, why do you need a new definition? We have consensus. Why not we just go for that definition? Well, it turns out, as I mentioned, that in this permissionless setting, it's actually important to think about economic notions of incentives. And so in order to take that into account, it's actually very important to actually have a different notion of what a blockchain is that actually considers that to some extent. And then we'll see, in fact, that Nakamoto actually achieves consistency. So very early on, Nakamoto, in his original paper, argued that this protocol is consistent, achieves consistency. But it only considered a very simplified type of attack. So natural attack on the protocol. And it showed under that attack it actually is secure. And then later on, people managed to extend it to more sophisticated class of attacks. In particular, it's a very nice paper by Garay et al. Showed that, in fact, all attacks fail if you consider asynchronous model of communication, where the attacker cannot delay any messages. But then it turned out that actual delays turned out to be quite powerful in this paper by Sampolinsky and Zohar. And indeed, then attacks started coming using network delays, and showed that actually there is a 49.1 attack if you assume a network latency of 10. And then later on, we managed to show that actually network attacks also, network delays actually don't help. Okay? So that's going to be the plan. We're going to try to discuss this. And after we have discussed, so I'm going to try to give you a high level of, before the break, of this notion of what a blockchain is, an abstract notion, and also Nakamoto's protocol. And then in the second part, we'll discuss a little bit about how to prove it secure, and then we'll move on to this other setting of proof of stake. All right, so now what is a blockchain? So a blockchain is just a bunch of blocks that are chained together. Okay, good, now you know. And these blocks should, you should think of them as a block of transactions. So it's just a set of transactions that are put together, and we're going to confirm these transactions block by block. Okay? And it's important that these are chained together in order to get this consistency notion that once something has been added, it cannot be removed. Okay, so how do we build a blockchain? And what I'm going to do now is a little bit confusing. I'm going to start by giving you the protocol, Nakamoto's protocol, and then I'll move on to the definition. Okay? Typically, we'd like to see a definition first, but it will be kind of more natural if you see the protocol first and then move on to the definition. So how do we build this blockchain in Nakamoto's protocol? So let's say that we've already constructed a blockchain that has these 3 blocks in it. Okay? And now I would like to add a new block. I would like to add a new block to this ledger of transactions. And this block, we said, is a bunch of transactions, okay, that we'd like to confirm. Now this protocol, Nakamoto's protocol, it's a crazy, crazy protocol. It's insanely simple. It's nuts. Consensus protocols before were very complicated, or at least quite like subtle and confusing. In contrast, this is a protocol that's going to have like a 2-line description. Okay? So this is what we're supposed to do. Okay, there's a bunch of transactions. Sorry, my joke here came. The first time I gave this talk, 10 bitcoins here was this little bike. Now it's this. And had to update it. Okay, but so we have a bunch of transactions here, and we'd like to add them. This is what the player should do. Okay? All the participants here try to get this new block of transactions confirmed. And they do it by looking at the last block in the chain, putting that into a hash function, together with this new set of transactions, and a random string. So we look at the last block that's been confirmed. Okay, we're actually not going to put in the whole thing, we're going to put in a hash of it, but okay. So think of it as saying, I put in the last block, the new set of transactions, that's this, and a random string. And I hash it. That's it. Okay, that's what everybody does. Everybody wants to participate. You want to add this block? Great, just do this. Hash, 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 hash. Until somebody finds a hash that's going to be small. Let's say starts with 20 zeros. Okay? And so this D here, this value of the turning small, we're going to call it the difficulty of the puzzle. Okay, so the protocol is parameterized by the difficulty D. And we're going to call the puzzle here, this random string, the puzzle solution. So we continue running this until somebody finds a puzzle solution. And whenever somebody found a puzzle solution, so something that hashes to something that starts with 20 zeros, let's say, if so, we're going to broadcast it to everybody else, we send it to everybody else, and that's a new block that we found. And that has now been added. Okay. All throughout today's talk, I'm going to assume that this hash function is a random function. It behaves like a random oracle. Okay? And what I mean by that is that the best way to kind of use this is, it's brute force search. Okay? Like calling this function is the best way to use it. Now, I have to specify one more thing. Okay? What I just specified is what honest players do when there is just a single chain. Right? We look at what's there, the last block, and that's what we put into the hash function. However, what if I join the network and I see here is one chain like this, and then there's a fork, we call this. What should I do? Well, as written here on the slide, clearly I should believe the longest chain, and that's why it's called the longest chain rule. So I'm going to actually take this as an input to my hash. And now this is the whole protocol. Okay, so the protocol just says, look, you join the network, you want to add a block, great, start hashing, 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 until you find something that starts with a bunch of zeros. Yeah?
Why does the function needs to be a random oracle? Doesn't it just needs to be like a randomized slow process?
Great, okay, it's still open to prove this. Okay, that's a great question. Why does it need to be random oracle? Well, we have not managed to prove it under any other assumption. Okay? All right, let's now discuss the security of this a little bit. Okay? So Ellie had bought this bike or house from Dan, and he paid him, and this transaction got added here to the block. And now let's say that he wants to erase this transaction and use the money again. Now note that if Ellie manages to get a chain that's longer, that doesn't contain this transaction, it just tries to mine something longer, at that point, when it becomes longer, everybody's going to go for that, right? And then what happened here is going to be gone, right? So in order to break this system, it suffices to find a chain that's longer than a real chain, whatever a real chain means here. Okay. And if you think about it, that can actually happen, right? Could be that this thing got added, and then something in parallel, somebody else managed to find something also at the same time, roughly. And then maybe people continue there. And in that case, this will be killed off, and it's called an orphan block or orphan chain. Now, Nakamoto was clearly aware of this thing. And so what he suggested was, actually, if the transaction is sufficiently deep, in a block that's sufficiently deep down in the chain, in that case, it cannot be reversed. And in fact, that's what he argued, that if the only thing you're trying to do is this attack of just trying to mine a chain that's longer on the side, that's not going to succeed. So just mining a separate chain is not going to help you unless the attacker has more than 50% of the computational power. Clearly, if I have 50% of the computational power, then I can always just, with my speed car, go faster than everybody else. But if I have less than 50%, then this chain on top here is going to go faster because the good guys are going to be here, and I will never catch up again. Now, it's not true. Like, this is all probabilistic. Even if, like, say the good guys have 70% and I have 30%, it could be that I'm lucky 3 times in a row, right? And in that case, my chain might grow 3 times before their chain grows. That happens with roughly 10% probability, right? Or no, less, 3% probability. Okay, so 3% is pretty big. So I can actually maybe get ahead 3 times with 3% probability. But if the transaction is far behind, I need to get ahead many times in a row. And that's going to be unlikely. So indeed, that's why Nakamoto said, look, you're only confirmed if there are 6 blocks after you. That's when you're confirmed. So think of this chain as kind of the working memory. It's really not things that are confirmed yet. They're things that are processing, right? And then if there are 6 blocks after them, that's when they're confirmed. So until you have 6 blocks after you think of this thing as being, processing. It's current, it's on in process of being confirmed. Okay. So that now brings me to the definition of what a blockchain is. So capturing kind of Nakamoto's idea of things are only consistent when there are many things afterwards, the way we'll define consistency is to say, take any 2 honest nodes. If I get rid of k blocks at the end, where k is a security parameter, then we should agree to what's there. That's number 1. Okay, so that's what's consistency. And it's actually very important here to also include future self-consistency. Okay? So not just take any nodes, but also I need to consider myself, consistency with myself in the future. Here's a second thing, and this is a notion that's really just makes sense in the blockchain world, but it's a very important property. It's something called chain quality. So if I look at the chain of blocks, what fraction of these blocks have been proposed by good guys? That's what we're going to call the chain quality. The fraction of blocks that have been proposed by good guys. Okay? Looking forward, why do we care about chain quality? Or actually not, because I probably won't have time to discuss that. The reason we care about chain quality is that the reason people want to participate in something like this is that they get paid to mine blocks. Right? Whenever you mine a block, you actually get some reward. Otherwise, why would people want to waste all this computational energy? So here, we'd like to make sure that the good guys get paid for the work. And ideally, the chain quality we would like to have is the same as the fraction of good guys in the system. So if I have 80% good guys in the system, then 80% of the blocks should be proposed by good guys. That's ideally what I'd like to get. Right? Turns out Nakamoto doesn't satisfy that, but that would be the ideal notion. So chain quality just says what fraction of blocks are achieved by good guys. And then the final thing, is something called chain growth, which means that the chain should actually grow at a steady pace.
K equals 6 in the Nakamoto.
K equals 6, yes.
So exponential is minus 6.
It's not great, yes.
So why did he set the number 6?
Maybe it's good enough for buying chewing gum, right? If you want to buy coffee and chewing gum, you're fine. If you want to transfer $1 million, I would wait a little bit longer. So I think so if you transact with Coinbase or something, I don't know what, they don't wait a lot, maybe you can tell us, they wait much more than 6, right? So depending on how important the transaction is, you need to wait much longer to get real confirmation. Nakamoto said 6 because maybe he wasn't envisioning this to be used for these huge transactions. But it's up to you to know. That's kind of cool here, that you decide how sure you want to be. If you're buying chewing gum and you want to get, then you can maybe just wait 2, right? If you're buying a house, I would maybe wait 30, okay?
And for chain quality, how do you define the bad guy?
How do you define the bad guy? So I don't need to define the bad guy. I can just define what fraction of good guys. What fraction of the blocks go from good guys.
How do you define the good guy?
So it's actually kind of subtle to define this, and I will refer you to the paper. So chain quality is not completely trivial to define, but it can be defined, and let me not go into it here. All right, before the break, I'll actually just make a simple exercise here. Show to me that if you have something satisfying these properties, then you can get standard consensus. A standard state machine application satisfying consistency aliveness. Can someone tell me how to do it? So given a blockchain, how do I get consensus? Nobody? Okay, I'll tell you that. So if you have a blockchain, what you do is you truncate k bits, k blocks from the end, and you output everything before that. Okay? That's going to be your consensus protocol. Now, consistency of this thing will follow directly from this consistency, right? By definition, because we said we have consistency once I truncate. Done. Now I need to argue that I have liveness. Can someone do this for me? Yeah.
Given your definition of chain quality, then you have enough honest participants, so there's some bound on when transactions are included, even if they're censored by the...
Indeed, great. But you're missing one thing. I need to use chain growth also.
Okay, then I would add chain growth to that to say, well, the chain is growing, and so eventually they're going to...
Exactly, so that's the point. So by chain growth, the chain is growing, If the chain is sufficiently has grown, then I know that for this last segment, I'm going to have sufficiently many good guys here, and the good guys are going to include the transaction, even if bad guys are censoring it. Great. So that's why a blockchain satisfying these properties actually satisfies consensus. John.
So don't you have an implication in the other direction also? I mean, consistency on the right is stronger than consistency on the left. And
yes.
This implies the two things on the left.
Yes, but it's not clear what chain quality is.
You mean it's not clear what the value...
it's not clear how to define, from this thing, how to define chain quality and...
Well, it's at least, it depends...
yeah, no, so you can get some weak, yeah.
You definitely achieve some...
You can achieve something, yes, but here typically you would want something that has good chain quality because that is...
It depends on the polynomial for the confirm time on the right.
Yeah, indeed. And so I think that's the reason to kind of work with this thing is to be able to get is really the chain quality because that has incentive implications.
And actually, while we're on the topic, I mean, regarding Hugo's question before, the base of the exponent depends on all your assumptions about the fraction of corruptions and the network speed and everything else. So you may get better than 2 to the minus 6 or e to the minus 6, or you may get worse, depends on your assumptions.
Yeah, so that is, of course, an assumption on that the attacker can adversarially do things, yes. Are we on a break, or? Or we have more time? 5 more minutes? Okay, so at least 5 more minutes, then I will state the theorem, and then we're going to go over a high level of our proof in the next part. Okay, so the result we showed in 2016 was that indeed this protocol satisfies these 3 properties and therefore gives us consensus. Even if the attacker controls up to 50% of the computational power, so rho here is the fraction of computational power held by the attacker. Okay, so if the attacker has less than 50% of the computational power in the world, or that's being invested, then if you set the mining difficulty appropriately, then the protocol will be secure. Okay, so it all depends on setting the mining difficulty correctly. And this needs to be set as a function of the network delay and the total mining power. And okay, so it gives you consistency, it gives you chain growth, it gives some chain quality that's kind of bizarre. Okay, so it's kind of hard to interpret what this is. Let's just say that if the attacker controls with less than 1/3, the guarantee we get is that the chain quality is at least 1/2. So if the attacker controls 1/3, the good guys will get at least 1/2. So that's not optimal, right? The good guys have 2/3 of the computational power, but they only get half of the mining rewards. So it does not have optimal chain quality. And indeed, this can be shown to be optimal. I won't have time to go into it, but there are some beautiful so-called selfish mining attacks that show that an attacker actually can get more than his fair share of the rewards. So this really is the optimal bound. It's not great because it means that we're not properly incentivizing players, right? But it is what it is, and so far, I guess it's still running. Yeah?
Under this theorem, is the mining difficulty set before the protocol, or can it be dynamic throughout the protocol?
Okay, so this is a great question. So in Nakamoto, it is actually dynamic, but it needs to update in order to adjust to these things. Let me just, for now, for simplicity, focus on this thing being fixed. Okay, the total mining power is fixed. It's not known, but it's fixed. Okay.
Is there any analysis trying to?
Yes, there is. There is. It's much more complicated. Let me not get into this now, but yes, it can be. There is a difficult adjustment. It's another beast. Okay. So what does it mean to be set correctly here? Okay. So what it means to be set correctly is that blocks, in essence, need to be found slower than delta, where delta is a bound on a network latency. Okay? So I need to make sure that this difficulty D, the number of zeros you need to get in the beginning, is set so that blocks are found slower than 10 seconds. Okay? Much slower than 10 seconds. On average, yeah. Okay? And what I would like to leave you with here before the break is that when we looked at Nakamoto's protocol, it looked like protocol is partially synchronous. In fact, originally, that's what people thought. This is a partially synchronous protocol. There is no delta mentioned in its protocol, right? There's no synchrony assumptions. It's not that we're like, let's wait delta steps before we do something. It doesn't occur at all, right? So it looks like a partially synchronous protocol. It's not, right? The protocol looks that way, but there is a D, the mining difficulty, okay? And Nakamoto said it to be, let's find blocks every 10 minutes. Why every 10 minutes? Okay? Turns out that 10 minutes is really very tailored to the network latency. Okay? So this is a synchronous protocol. It only works if the difficulty 10 minutes is set correctly as a function of the maximum network latency. If the network latency is more than 10 minutes, this protocol is not secure. Okay? It can be broken. All right, so we'll take a break for lunch, and then we'll continue discussing this analysis a little bit, and then we're moving on to proof of stake.